Hello, guys. Welcome to another talk of Sarah Colassa Architecture Talk Tank. Today I have an exciting guest, Geroge Valdez. He's from a company called Monograph, and they're doing really exciting things. I'll let George introduce himself properly and tell you a little bit about Monograph first. But what we're going to talk about today is marketing, and it's quite a big topic. I was kind of trying to avoid the generalization of a topic on marketing because there's a lot of marketeers I know in architecture, and I didn't want to repeat content from before, but I just think that George is a perfect person to cover this topic and also tell you a little bit about the general problems that there are with marketing and why architects altogether haven't been using it appropriately, or at least in the way that is like the most efficient for a business that perhaps is more oftenly practiced in other businesses in architecture. So I'll let you introduce yourself properly, George.
Yeah. Hi. Hi everyone. Thanks so much, Sarah, for this opportunity to kind of chat about this. Really passionate about it. So I guess I'll give you a little background about myself. I studied landscape architecture and architecture, landscape architecture in my undergrad, and then architecture in graduate school. And it was in graduate school where I kind of realized that what I was most interested in was how things, not how things came together from like material perspective, but more systemically, like why should we even be designing buildings in the first place to some degree, or whether that was the right answer to solve. And so from there, I basically ended up joining with a friend of mine going into tech, and have been working in tech since 2013 at various companies. Worked in things like AR with Google Glass through to VR with Iris VR, and have most recently, before Monograph, worked at WeWork, where I was part of the global growth strategy team. And maybe some of those influences will kind of leak into the conversation. But my most recent role currently is at Monograph. I joined the team in November, and I'm part of the growth team. So we can talk a little bit about what growth means, but yeah, and so that's a little bit of my background.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, like I said before, I'm not sure if everybody knows the story of how like marketing was actually prohibited for architects, but that's basically, I think, the reason why architects haven't used marketing to its fullest extent. Can you elaborate a little bit on what are the general problems in marketing within how it's conducted today?
Yeah, I mean, it's not certain that there's problems. I would frame it more as that the issue is it's in some ways too broad in what it does, and in some ways it's not targeted enough. And but what I mean by that is um, essentially, if you peel back the onion on what marketing looks like today in an architecture firm, it essentially looks like really a mix of sales enablement, and I can define that in a second. Sales enablement, graphic design, and more like communications management. And the thing there is that marketing in most other organizations is a very outward facing initiative. It's not reactive, meaning that a lot of marketing teams are focused on doing like RFPs, or I would say mostly like passive type of work, not necessarily they're generating leads. And so basically in the tech company, in the tech industry and other types of industries, marketing has a very specific function to help generate demand. And that's why there's even titles like demand gen, in which those type of people are focused on using various digital mediums to and out of home campaign, what they call out of home campaigns, like billboards and stuff like that, to start to generate interest. And I think a lot of this is an offshoot from, like as you mentioned, Sarah, about how in the like around the 70s and in the U.S. specifically. I'm not sure as familiar with other countries, but the general premise before the 70s was that marketing was a bad word, and that no, to use older language that they used to have in the AIA documents, no gentleman would put themselves out there using marketing. And so I think because of that, there's been this idea of marketing not even having like executives ownership, meaning there's very few marketing leaders within an organization at the executive level. And I think those collectively together make for an environment that's not very measurable, that's not very outcomes driven, and ultimately it's almost they enable, right, the sales enablement side, they mostly enable sales to happen or for deals to close. And so they act as a supporting function to business development, when in reality they should also be helping to generate business, not just business development.
And so how does that really apply to what would be like the right model of marketing and, you know, within like kind of within its function?
I would say that, you know, if we take those three things, right, that there's communications management, sales enablement, and graphic design, like actually build it out that way if you want to maintain sort of the structure that you have today, and be explicit about what those roles look like. It shouldn't be that you hire a graphic designer necessarily to do communications management as well, and on all these other things. Like, let people do the work that they really feel most passionate about within those different areas, and then you know, give them ownership. Um, I'd say if you wanted to think a bit differently about how to structure the organization so that it works more in sync with business development, then one of the interesting things that was happening at WeWork when I was there was this idea of account-based selling or account-based management, which was very different than a lot of other, let's say, or organizations that sold space, because essentially what you would do is you'd have your targeted list of accounts, right? You know, especially when you have a very clear picture of who your potential client is, the kind of client that you want to go after, and you can create basically a list of what that looks like. You can work together with marketing to figure out how to get in front of those people. And so it's a much more targeted way of looking at marketing that's not just either not responding to like RFQs as I mentioned before, and using the tools that exist today, like social media, like you know, like even email. I think people don't use like cold emailing enough. It can be effective if you do it right and institutionalize and make processes around it. But yeah, I would position it basically on who is your customer, what do they need, and how can you then structure the organization to market to them most effectively. And I think that would be a good place to start. Additionally, one other point would be making sure that the team, because they own lead generation, has a way to report that. I find that some firms, it's very difficult to understand where, like, if they have a really good sense of where their leads are coming from, how are they being, you know, found out. And so there's a lot of tools that exist today to be able to actually create dashboards and have real measurable goals, you know, that the whole organization is trying to move towards. So I would say that's a big component to this puzzle. It's like being able to actually measure your impact and report on it. It's really, really huge.
And when it comes to like actually structuring the marketing department, with, you know, some of the things that you mentioned, but actually what else is there important to take a look at, for, you know, for a firm that would want to actually put some attention into it now, let's just say when we're in COVID, and you know, generate more leads, or perhaps like analyze their CAC, or again, like lifetime value of their you know, their services, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think during this time, it's probably very helpful to step back and take the time, since, you know, things have slowed down, to evaluate where the business is today. So if the firm feels like there's opportunities for improvement, then I think to start, it would be really helpful to understand what is, and just make sure that the entire firm understands too, like what's the mission and values of the company. What is, to start from like core fundamentals, like even to like the positioning, like how can the messaging get stronger as to like what the firm actually values, and how it can also bring value to a certain customer. The things that you can be doing today during this whole situation, taking a step back to like understand what is the entire journey of a customer. And by that I mean that, let's say for example, you focus on residential architecture, and there's still buildings that are going to be built after this whole thing, right? So we should take that as a premise. But let's say you focus on residential architecture. um, the it would be very helpful to understand the journey that people take from when they first have an idea of getting, wanting to buy a home, or to have hire an architect to hire a home. Typically, the idea of hiring an architect doesn't comes that early into the process. It typically comes after. Essentially, when people first look for is um, very basic stuff like, how do I purchase a property? How do I? And so there's all these questions that people have at the very beginning of their journey, before they even come into contact with an architect, that should be mapped out. You should know like what are the triggers, and in quotes, like the triggers that basically prompt someone to think about buying a new home, or move, or doing something like that. Like having a child is a really good example of one. My background here is the baby's room that we're nesting here. So it's top of mind for me. But those are acted as like trigger points that then create a whole series of questions that people want answered. And oftentimes architects sort of treat their content strategy, what they put on their website, almost like just as an archive of things that they've done. They don't go ahead and put content out there that tries to answer these questions. It would be useful for a firm to start to put together content that like answers, how do you buy a property? How do you evaluate it? What should you be looking out for? So that you're building, when someone comes across it through like Google or what other search engine, um, they can start to build a relationship with that firm, already knowing like, oh, this is a very knowledgeable firm. They're super helpful. They're giving this amazing information. I like to contact them. And that's just like a sort of an example of how you can take that idea of like, what are all the questions someone's trying to answer before they even come to an architect, and then what to do with that information. So you can build content. You can go to lecture, try to give lectures specifically on those topics, not talking about your work, but trying to be helpful and provide value upstream to that question that they have. You mentioned CAC and LTV. I think it'd be helpful to define those terms, because I think that's also, when we think about what to measure, it's a very important. Those are two very important terms. CAC is cost of acquisition. So for every single person that comes into your funnel, every potential client, with them comes the potential cost. And so even the cost of bringing them in to a conversation in a meeting should be something that's measured. How much did we spend in marketing initiatives to get that customer in the door? Once you're able to start to track those figures over time and see how they convert from a lead to an opportunity to an actual client, that helps you to then calibrate all your initiatives accordingly. And you can say, okay, well, maybe we need to like figure out maybe higher impact, lower cost initiatives to help get them to a lead, while someone else works on how to get them from a lead and build the right sales enablement collateral to get them from a lead to a client. Or even just helping to qualify them. Maybe you keep bringing in leads that are a waste of time, that they're not very well experienced in building things. They don't really have a very clear budget in mind, and you want to be able to measure that as well, so that you can adjust your messaging accordingly. Maybe you're something about your website's drawing people in that are not, uh, the right qualified lead. And the lifetime value part, it's almost like, in very clear terms, what it means is, what is the total amount of work that you could potentially get from this customer or this client? And so initially, we sometimes think of clients as like, okay, well, I just do one project for them. But oftentimes, because you've already built that relationship with them, this is where a lot of the major source of most work comes from for architecture firms. It's from those repeat clients. And so if you're able to say, okay, well, how can we expand the lifetime value of this customer? Then it starts to create cadences and campaigns and other activities around that, to help, whether it's like the marketing team creates an automated email that goes out that just like, hey, like want to invite you to our holiday party, or things like that that start to reconnect people over time, and most importantly, keep your firm top of mind to your network of people that you work with. And yeah, I think that's those are really good places to start. I mean, ultimately, you can always um, think about how. I mean, most importantly, just thinking about what the structure of your organization looks like today and how you can enable it to be set up to go after the clients that you want, not to just wait.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's when you're explaining all of this, I'm just thinking that I am familiar with concepts of how to like implement the analog experience of like obtaining leads and then translate it all into like a funnel. But it's this complex process really that takes a lot of steps along the way, like from even content creation and the topics you cover, understanding your audience, to lead generation, to lead magnets and things like that. And all of this has like a physical interpretation, but also has like a digital process behind it. Like you have to somehow automate parts of it as well. So essentially, like at the end, you can end up with an actual website funnel or a lead generation funnel, or perhaps a mailing list funnel, whatever that is. Where to, like, if someone doesn't know the process, right? Because it's elaborate. Where do they start to understand the relationship between like certain actions that you take and how that then translates into actually automation and the back end of it all? Because it works together.
Yeah, I think it depends on the kind of resources that you have. So if you're a smaller firm, obviously this is probably going to land on the CEO or the founders of the firm to think about um, more deeply and kind of dive a little bit deeper into these tools. There's a lot of great books that do exist out there and resources like that doesn't have to be within architecture. I would really encourage people to go outside of it to learn more advanced techniques because a lot of other industries are constantly spending a lot of resources into their marketing infrastructure. There's kind of like trends that emerge in marketing, and I feel like it, counter to architecture, where it's feel like it's pretty much stayed very much the same since a certain period of time. So books like From Impossible to Inevitable by Aaron Ross is really, really good. It kind of helps to really map out some of the techniques and strategies that other firms, that the companies have done. And I think it has sections a little bit on automation as well. There's YouTube videos galore on this subject. If they're really interested in learning more about marketing from a different perspective, this website called SaaStr, SaaStr.com, is an amazing resource for anybody interested in just learning about general leadership, strategies for sales, strategies for marketing, how to run an organization from 0 to 1,000 to 10,000 people, and how to scale that. It's really tactical advice. And then other than that, I feel like if you're a larger organization, then you should try to find someone in marketing, a marketing leader that is kind of plugged into that wants to own something, that wants to be innovative and wants to dig deeper into how to learn about these things. Maybe they come from a tradition, maybe they worked at other architecture practices, but they just have that itch that they need to scratch, which is basically like, how can I be better? And I think that is a really good quality to have in someone that you're going to hire for the marketing side. And that probably the best place to start if you can't yourself dive into the weeds so much. In terms of automation, probably best to start off with a consulting agency that does that kind of work to help educate. But then basically once your marketing organization understands the motions on how to make that happen, then they should be off to the races on their own.
going back to Monograph alone, it's such a great tool because it solves like a real life problem within the practice. Can you elaborate a little bit more and tell us a little more about how the tool works alone and how does it actually help managing projects and perhaps also the business management side of things?
Yeah. So I think the key thing about Monograph is that it sees the business and projects as completely tied together. And so a lot of what Monograph is trying to do is make sure that on any given day, you understand where your business is at, both at the project level as well as like the budget level, even the resource level. And by resource, in this case, we mean team members, right? Like how is the time being allocated to those team members? Where are we in the current state of the project? And it's basically trying to answer those questions, even to the point of like, what is our current real-time projection going out for the next year in terms of revenue or beyond, right? You want to be able to understand, forecast your revenue accordingly. And so that's the place where we start. We want to make sure that end to end it works for your business. The vision of the company is a bit much broader than that, in the sense that like most project management tools today are really focused on projects that you manage internally. And with the complexity of the world as it is today, in the sense that like all we're seeing today is more fragmentation, in the sense of like how many people are working on a project, how many different teams are working on a project. Even a residential project has 5, 6, 7 teams that are working on it, and all of them have their own project management solutions, their own way of sort of doing things. What we think is a big potential here is to make sure that the project is something that everyone can contribute to, that it's not just siloed within each of these organizations, but it's more effectively managed by everyone being able to work together and collaborate on it. So that's where we're hoping to go, alongside with some other really interesting insights that we've gathered along the way, working with so many architects about projects in relation to things like contracts and risk, which is very exciting.
You promised to elaborate a little bit about the role as a growth. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Growth is like, it covers so much. It's like I'm a little bit of like customer support. I'm a little bit of sales, and I'm a little bit of marketing. But and actually that makes a lot of sense, because all what at Monograph we do map out what the journey looks like for our customers. When are they first thinking about moving to a project management software? And because we step back and we measure the business from very key metrics, basically like we look at acquisition, well, we look at awareness, like how many people know about us. We look at acquisition, how many customers are we actually able to bring on as leads, all the way to converting to signed customers or actually using our product, and then all the way to renewals. So at some point, like a company wants to sign up again, and so we map out like 5 key numbers within the business, and my role is to help drive awareness all the way to acquisition and to retention. So basically make sure that they're staying with us longer. And when you approach it from that perspective, then marketing kind of looks very different, or the role looks very different, because ultimately what you're trying to do is develop key initiatives that are going to drive some of these numbers forward. And so it's a much more, you're always trying to prioritize what's the biggest problem here. Sometimes the biggest problem is not generating leads. It's actually that people are leaving because they're not being well educated on how to use the product. So then I come in and I'm like, okay, let me figure out how to write more articles for support, because we're a small team. So it also naturally means that I have to wear a lot of hats, but it also allows me to focus on like, okay, understanding the customer really deeply and how to make sure that they're having a great experience throughout, from when they first hear about us all the way through when they are in trial, like actually trying out the product itself. And so it's really kind of like what's exciting about it is that you're always kind of thinking about what is the most important thing to do today, not so much about doing something almost regularly. If anything, my job is to figure out what those initiatives are, mock them up, run experiments against them, and then the best performing initiatives, I playbook them, and I get resources to help systematize it and do more regular events with them. So it's a kind of broader look at the business, and that's what I find personally very exciting, is that sometimes it looks like marketing, some other days it looks like sales, and some other days it looks like customer success, but together it makes for a stronger, like every initiative just feels like you're working on the right thing.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. If our listeners want to find you and Monograph, where do they go?
Well, myself, you can look for George, as in George Washington Valdez, in LinkedIn. I'm there, or Twitter. Same. I don't think I have any changed. They're all George Valdez, which is nice. Or Instagram, and then for Monograph, it's monograph.io is the website. And yeah, that's the best way to reach us.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much for your time and very insightful look into marketing. And I hope that the listeners found a lot of value in this, and also that it prompts people to think a little bit about those strategies, because they really tie in very well with business strategy as well. And eventually, when implemented, it's easier also to manage teams and projects, I think. Okay, well, thank you so much, George. Thanks for your time. And thank you for the listeners as well.